There is exactly one politician in history who sued a newspaper for publishing a poll. There's only one politician in American history who is so constitutionally illiterate that he actually thinks you can sue a newspaper for commissioning and publishing a political poll. And now he's threatening to do it again because the New York Times published a poll showing only 32% of Americans think they are better off with Donald Trump as president than they were with Joe Biden as president. 49% say they are worse off and 19% say it's about the same. The New York Times poll published today that has provoked Donald Trump's newest absurd and empty threat to sue over a poll shows that 56% disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling his job as president. The poll shows that Donald Trump has lost the voters that gave him the Electoral College. The swing voters who swung from Joe Biden in 2020 to Donald Trump in 2024 have swung back away from Donald Trump. Donald Trump has lost them on the most important issues in the poll. And so you are not alone tonight in America if you disapprove of the way Donald Trump is managing the federal government. You are part of the 56% majority who thinks that. You're not alone tonight if you disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling Venezuela. You are joined by 53% of the country. You are not alone tonight if you disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You are part of the 54% who feel that way. You're not alone tonight if you disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling immigration and the economy and relationships with other countries. A powerful 58% majority disapproves tonight of how Donald Trump is handling those three issues: immigration, the economy, and relationships with other countries. That is the same amount of disapproval Donald Trump faces now in how he's handling the war between Russia and Ukraine. 58% disapproval. And on the final two numbers, on the final two issues, the numbers get much worse. On the issue that was widely considered the most important issue in the last presidential campaign, Donald Trump now has a 64% disapproval rating because 64% disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the cost of living. That's what the last campaign was supposed to be all about, the cost of living. And the swing voters reportedly swung to Donald Trump because of the cost of living, and now they all disapprove of what Donald Trump has done to them, what he has done to their cost of living. And there's only one number in the poll that is even worse for Donald Trump. It's the worst number in the poll. It's the kind of sky-high number that is seldom seen in issue polls like this. And it is the reason this program has focused so much attention on this issue over the course of the last year. It is the issue that has separated more voters from Donald Trump than any other issue. You are not alone tonight in America if you disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the Epstein files. 66% disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the Epstein files. 74% of independents disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the Epstein files. And a full 25% of Republicans now disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the Epstein files. And that is as high a disapproval among Republicans as it gets for Donald Trump. There are Trump voters who support Donald Trump on every issue, no matter what. A 77-year-old man in Dedham, Massachusetts, told the New York Times in his response to the polling questions, quote, "I mean, Donald Trump could look at me in the face and tell me to go screw myself, and I'd say thank you." Separating Trump voters from Donald Trump is the most difficult political exercise anyone has ever tried to do. But a dead man is doing it. From the grave, Donald Trump's old friend, Jeffrey Epstein, is separating more voters from Donald Trump than any issue ever has. Donald Trump's relentless campaign to keep the Epstein files hidden has ended up revealing the real Donald Trump in a way that his voters can now easily understand. Tonight, Donald Trump is in his 33rd day of violating the law that requires the release of the Epstein files, full release, all the files. It is part of the long list that proves Donald Trump's sheer hatred of the rule of law. It's not that Donald Trump doesn't respect the rule of law. It's not that Donald Trump doesn't understand the rule of law. It's that he hates the rule of law. The law must never apply to him. Donald Trump has abused every concept of the rule of law that has been observed by all other politicians throughout our history. He has done it on the civil side of our law and on the criminal side of our law. Suing the Des Moines Register for issuing a poll in the last presidential election? That's Donald Trump's hatred of the civil rule of law that says you can't do that. There's a First Amendment. Can't do that. Donald Trump wants to close down television networks if anyone on the network says anything negative about Donald Trump because he hates the rule of law that prevents that from happening. Today, the man who tried to force Donald Trump to submit to the criminal rule of law by indicting him for a conspiracy against the United States in trying to overturn the presidential election and for violations of the Espionage Act in his illegal possession of classified documents, explained the aspects of his investigation of Donald Trump that he is allowed to discuss publicly at the House Judiciary Committee. And while former Special Prosecutor Jack Smith was testifying, Donald Trump from Air Force One issued a social media post saying, quote, "Jack Smith is a deranged animal." Republicans on the committee who defend language like that all the time only when it comes from Donald Trump, and whose relationship to the truth is identical to Donald Trump's, kept insisting that Jack Smith was an unfair prosecutor who took orders directly from Joe Biden, even though Jack Smith has never spoken to Joe Biden. And all of the pathetically lying Republicans on the committee support Donald Trump's public instruction to his owned and operated federal prosecutors now at the Trump Justice Department to prosecute people in that same post. Donald Trump, of all people, called Jack Smith a deranged animal. He said, quote, "Hopefully the Attorney General is looking at what he's done." Joe Biden, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and every president you can name between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump never did that, never thought about doing that. They never told the Attorney General who they should be investigating and prosecuting. Donald Trump violates that principle all the time, and he does it publicly. 3 hours later, Donald Trump said, quote, "There is no question that deranged Jack Smith should be prosecuted for his actions." You could not ask for a more flagrant, screamingly obvious proof of a president personally ordering prosecutions than what Donald Trump put in writing today, while lying Republicans on that committee were trying to pretend that Joe Biden or any other president would ever do anything like that. The Republican questions at the committee today ranged from the ignorant to the idiotic.
I want to start by saying that starting out, I was not real familiar with this issue. In fact, when chairman of the committee told me we had Jack Smith coming in, my first response privately was, "Who's Jack Smith?" And so my one question for you, Jack Smith, is are you familiar with the Vietnamese city of Bến Tre?
Other Republicans asked repeated, pointless questions about how Jack Smith was appointed special prosecutor, but not one of them discussed the actual evidence that Jack Smith called proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump committed the crimes of conspiracy against the United States and violations of the Espionage Act. The first sentence Jack Smith spoke to the committee today in his opening remarks was, quote, "I love my country." He said in his testimony that he has no party loyalties. And then Jack Smith said this.
President Trump was charged because the evidence established that he willfully broke the law. the very laws he took an oath to uphold. Grand juries in 2 separate districts reached this conclusion based on his actions, as alleged in the indictments they returned. Rather than accept his defeat in the 2020 election, President Trump engaged in a criminal scheme to overturn the results and prevent the lawful transfer of power. After leaving office in January of 21, President Trump illegally kept classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago social club and repeatedly tried to obstruct justice to conceal his continued retention of those documents. Highly sensitive national security information was held in a ballroom and a bathroom. Our investigation developed proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump engaged in criminal activity.
This is what Jack Smith said about the principle he has dedicated his life to, the rule of law.
After nearly 30 years of public service, including in international settings, I have seen how the rule of law can erode. My fear is that we have seen the rule of law function in our country for so long that many of us have come to take it for granted. The rule of law is not self-executing. It depends on our collective commitment to apply it.
The collective commitment to apply the rule of law was not present in the House Judiciary Committee hearing room today. The Republican side of that committee, along with almost all of the Republican House of Representatives and almost all of the Republican Senate, have abandoned the rule of law to embrace the rule of Donald Trump. And for that, history will reward them with nothing but disgrace. Leading off our discussion tonight is Professor Laurence Tribe, who has taught constitutional law at Harvard Law School for 5 decades. Professor Tribe, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I want to begin with you tonight on this point that Jack Smith raised, that we just heard him say, his fear. He says, my fear is that we have seen the rule of law function in our country for so long that many of us have come to take it for granted. I think that certainly applies to me. Certainly at the beginning of the Trump era, I had come to take it for granted. He said the rule of law is not self-executing. It depends on our collective commitment to apply it. What is your assessment of the status of the rule of law in America tonight?
I think the rule of law is in grave danger. It's in danger in part because, as Jack Smith so eloquently said in his closing, we take it for granted. We assume, almost as we assume that there is air to breathe and land to walk on, we assume that the rule of law is just there. And for most of us, much of the time, it is. We obey the rules of traffic. We file our taxes, even though the tax collector doesn't come knocking except very rarely. But there are people in this country for whom the rule of law has ceased to apply. The President of the United States, those immediately around him, those who take his orders, those who commit violent acts and storm the Capitol only to be pardoned en masse by Donald Trump. Now that's extremely dangerous. And one of the reasons that it's happened is that we have gotten accustomed to multiple realities. There is the reality that most of us see with our eyes, hear with our ears, and there is the reality that is fed to us through fake issued statements through Donald Trump and his Truth, ironically named Social. It was so surreal to have Republican after Republican today lying about things we all saw, things they saw about January 6th, in a room full of people, including both members of Congress and Capitol Police who were there. Some years ago, that would have been breaking news. members of Congress obviously lying about things that happened in front of them. And when you look at the questions they asked to try to dent the powerful summation that we heard today of the overwhelming evidence of 4 grave felonies by Donald Trump related to overturning a lawful election and 40 more felonies involving stealing highly classified information and hiding it in bathrooms and ballrooms and other places where foreign spies could even see it. The kinds of questions that they asked to deal with that calm, compelling testimony had nothing to do with actually undermining it. They quibbled in some questions about exactly what details accompanied the first taking of the oath by Jack Smith, perhaps when he was overseas, but if there was any technical problem, it was irrelevant and it was cured. They asked questions, really amazing questions about, wasn't it odd that it was only the telephone records of Republicans in Congress that were subpoenaed by Jack Smith? You would have obviously expected that when he's looking for the people that Donald Trump telephoned to find out when he called them and how long the call lasted, sure, he would have expected that he would have sought the phone records of Democrats. He would be very likely to have called Democrats when it was Republicans that he was trying to force into helping him stay in power. On top of that, there was all this nonsense about Cassidy Hutchinson. She was talking about what others told her. That's called hearsay. Of course, the rules that applied in the January 6th hearing didn't include a rule against hearsay in any way. All she was trying to do was prove something that Donald Trump admitted to himself, namely that he wanted to accompany the mob to the Capitol. The way she tried to prove it was that somebody told her that he reached for the wheel of the limo. Well, maybe he didn't, but that was only relevant because it was another way of showing that he wanted to go with his mob to the Capitol, and he's admitted that he wanted to. So, big deal about Cassidy. She almost certainly wouldn't have been called as a witness. There were things like, another one that just amazed me was, yes, it wasn't Donald Trump who was responsible for trying to overturn a lawful election. It was Nancy Pelosi and the Capitol Police. They're the ones who should have called the National Guard. But the law makes it absolutely clear that the one National Guard that is under the exclusive and complete control of the president is the National Guard of Washington, D.C. He doesn't have the right to call in the National Guard as a kind of military force to occupy Minneapolis the way he's tried to do, or other places. The place he does have the power to call the National Guard is D.C. So what we witnessed was a bizarre saga in which we have a career prosecutor, no axe to grind, never talked to Biden, never talked to Garland, doing his job. The Republicans accusing him of being a partisan puppet, doing the bidding of the government, of the White House, at the very same time that the person who now occupies the White House is directing his Justice Department in the most partisan way possible to prosecute people like Jack Smith who are just doing their job. So it's a kind of split screen reality, but what's at stake is not just these theatrics. What's at stake is the future of our country. Because what happened in 2020 when Donald Trump conspired to stay in power despite losing, according to all 60 courts that looked at it, was a kind of dress rehearsal for what might happen in 2028, when it is not Kamala Harris or anyone like her who's going to be in the driver's seat. It's going to be J.D. Vance, who, as vice president, will be in charge of counting the ballots. So I worry that as the rule of law is on the chopping block, that our whole democracy is on the chopping block as well. We have to step up. We have to be courageous. Talk about courage. There was enormous courage witnessed today by Jack Smith, who's been threatened, his family's been threatened, but he does his job anyway, and he tells the truth. We have to be courageous. We cannot allow the rule of law and the Constitution that we take for granted to simply fade away. They are not self-executing. They take human effort to preserve.
Harvard Law Professor Lawrence Tribe, thank you very much for starting off our discussion tonight.
Thank you, Lawrence.
And coming up, the thing Republicans feared most in today's testimony by... The one thing that Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee today feared the most and refused to discuss was the evidence that Jack Smith developed to prove Donald Trump committed crimes. And so not one Republican had any response to this line of questioning from Democrat Pramila Jayapal.
Did he pressure state officials to ignore true vote counts in those states?
Yes.
Did he spread lies and conspiracies to his followers to make them believe that the election had been illegally rigged against him?
Yes.
Did he pressure DOJ officials to stop the certification of the election?
He did.
Did he pressure his own vice president, Mike Pence, to stop the certification against the oath of office that he had sworn to the Constitution?
He did.
And when all of this didn't work, did he, Donald Trump, motivate and inspire an angry mob to the U.S. Capitol to stop the certification?
Our proof showed that he caused what happened on January 6th, that it was foreseeable, and that he exploited that violence.
Did Donald Trump know that his allegations of election fraud were lies when he spread them?
Our proof was that he did, and we intended to prove that at trial.
Joining us now is Andrew Weissmann, former FBI General Counsel and an MS Now legal analyst. Andrew, I want to go to the last point that Jack Smith made, and that is, did Donald Trump know that he was lying when he was talking about the election? And Republicans on the committee, as you saw today, this is one of their favorite things, was to claim that Donald Trump believed his lies. And if Donald Trump believed what he was saying, then there's no fraud here.
Yes, well, Jack Smith had an answer for that. So he pointed out the substantial evidence of people within his own administration, within his own campaign, who told him that he had lost. He pointed to evidence that Donald Trump was willing to believe anything that was as far-fetched and fanciful as could be imagined if it would keep him in power, that he deliberately, according to Jack Smith's testimony, didn't seek out the advice and the opinions and the facts from people who actually would be able to tell him there was no fraud in the election. And that pattern happened over and over again. If it was information that would keep him in office and keep him in power, then he sought it out. If it was something against him, he did not. And that was, to me, very compelling. We, of course, do not have a trial. Unlike other countries that have held leaders to account, we get a giant F in terms of holding Donald Trump to account, at least federally, on both of these indictments.
The other issue that they were stuck on was the idea that only phone records of Republican members of Congress were subpoenaed by Jack Smith, which of course harkens back to Watergate, where 40 people were convicted of committing crimes for and with Republican President Richard Nixon. And all of them were Republicans. Big surprise, there were no Democrats conspiring with a Republican president then to commit crimes for and with the Republican president. And it looks like this case is the same thing.
There were so many efforts to distract and to make arguments that just don't pass the straight face test and not deal with the actual evidence. There was just a dearth of dealing with what most of the members today experienced and witnessed themselves on January 6th and knew that there was a violent attack on the Capitol. What they themselves said about it at the time, about it being a crime and the president being responsible and the necessity for him to be held accountable. So the sort of cognitive dissonance that was going on was truly remarkable. I think that maybe the lowest point was one Republican turning into the Capitol Police and saying this was all their fault, as if that, even if, let's assume that was true, of course it's not, that doesn't mean that it's their fault that the Capitol was attacked because they attacked the Capitol. What they were saying, what this person was saying is that these are Capitol Police that could have prevented this from happening. Well, you know who was in charge of the Capitol Police? You know who was the president at the time? Donald Trump. And Donald Trump didn't do anything beforehand to prevent it, and he certainly didn't do anything at the time to prevent it. It took hours and enormous convincing by people within the White House to get him to do anything, even after he issued a tweet that Jack Smith testified truly endangered his own vice president.
Are we going to see the second Jack Smith report on the classified documents case?
Wonderful question. That is a report that Judge Cannon has had issued an order that has been pending for about a year that has precluded that report from being seen. Now that is supposed to be released in February. However, Donald Trump has now made an application to Judge Cannon to have it never be released. So we don't know what Judge Cannon will do with that, but I do suspect even if Judge Cannon were to grant that motion, that she will be reversed for a third time by the Court of Appeals that oversees her. So that's a long way of saying that although Donald Trump is taking this last gasp to have it continue to be hidden from us, I think that we will see it, that I think the Court of Appeals there won't tolerate any more nonsense. Remember, it is the Court of Appeals that said to Judge Cannon, you really cannot sit on this motion and let it linger. You have to issue an order here so that if we disagree with it, we can overrule you.
Andrew Weissmann, thank you very much for joining us. I found Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony to the January 6th committee compelling, convincing, and fully believable. And I still believe Cassidy Hutchinson, even though today Republicans tried to discredit just some of Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony to the January 6th committee because it was technically within the legal definition of hearsay, which does not mean that it wasn't true.
When you returned to the White House in the motorcade after the president's speech, where did you go?
When I returned to the White House, I walked upstairs towards the Chief of Staff's office, and I noticed Mr. Ornato lingering outside of the office. Once we had made eye contact, he quickly waved me to go into his office, which was just across the hall from mine. When I went in, he shut the door, and I noticed Bobby Engel, who is the head of Mr. Trump's security detail, sitting in a chair, just looking somewhat discombobulated and a little lost. And I looked at Tony, and he had said, "Did you effing hear what happened in the Beast?" I said, "No, Tony, I just got back. What happened?" Tony proceeded to tell me that when the president got in the Beast, he was under the impression from Mr. Meadows that the off-the-record movement to the Capitol was still possible and likely to happen, but that Bobby had more information. So once the president had gotten into the vehicle with Bobby, he thought that they were going up to the Capitol, and when Bobby had relayed to him, "We're not, you don't have the assets to do it, it's not secure, we're going back to the West Wing," the president had very strong, a very angry response to that. Tony described him as being irate. The president said something to the effect of, "I'm the effing president, take me up to the Capitol now." To which Bobby responded, "Sir, we have to go back to the West Wing." The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Engel grabbed his arm, said, "Sir, you need to take your hand off the steering wheel. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol." Mr. Trump then used his free hand to lunge towards Bobby Engel. And when Mr. Ornato had recounted this story to me, he had motioned towards his clavicles.
And was Mr. Engel in the room as Mr. Ornato told you this story?
He was.
Did Mr. Engel correct or disagree with any part of the story from Mr. Ornato?
Mr. Engel did not correct or disagree with any part of the story.
Did Mr. Engel or Mr. Ornato ever after that tell you that what Mr. Ornato had just said was untrue?
Neither Mr. Ornato nor Mr. Engel told me ever that it was untrue.
Joining us now is Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee and former U.S. Attorney, federal prosecutor in Rhode Island. Senator, from your federal prosecutor perspective, I want to get into this issue of hearsay. We all use hearsay in our lives all the time. Someone tells you, "Hey, I heard that house might be available. They haven't listed it yet." And sure enough, it is. It's hearsay, but now you have a new house because it was good hearsay. There are reasons why that kind of testimony is not allowed in court, but in congressional hearings, testimony, hearsay testimony, and testimony like that is very common, isn't it?
It certainly is. And in fact, it's actually allowed fairly regularly in court when there are circumstances that justify the admission of the hearsay testimony. You get a ruling from the judge that says, yeah, you can go ahead with that testimony, and then you can. I think this whole episode of the Republicans trying to rebut Ms. Hutchinson's testimony in the January 6th commission is a little peculiar because this was a hearing about Jack Smith and the prosecution of his criminal case against the president, which he has never had a chance to actually put before a jury because it has been obstructed by Republicans and by the Supreme Court, saying peculiarly that this president has an ultimate immunity. So that's an issue that would be worked out before trial had Jack Smith's case been allowed to proceed. And the real key with Jack Smith is his sworn testimony that I had the evidence sufficient to convict Mr. Trump beyond a reasonable doubt. And whether or not he used Ms. Hutchinson's testimony to do that is really beside the point. It shows what a struggle the Republicans were having today to try to deal with Jack Smith, that they had to go back to the January 6th commission and to testimony that may or may not have even been offered in a criminal case of United States versus Donald Trump.
And prosecutors and lawyers making cases usually talk to more people than they end up using on the witness stand in court. Sometimes they make the decision on the spot, make a decision, we're not going to go to that witness. And it's not, there's no negative inference to be taken about the witness who they don't use. And many of these witnesses, especially when they're talking about hearsay, are showing prosecutors avenues to pursue. She's telling you who else was in that room, or, talk to the two people who are in the room, see what they might tell you. That could lead you to somewhere else. So this idea that this perfectly normal testimony that she was giving in the committee somehow had no value was something that the Republicans were just obsessed with today.
Yeah, completely standard stuff preparing for a criminal trial, to look at the universe of available evidence and then pick within that universe the elements that will prove your case beyond that reasonable doubt. And by the way, one of the exceptions to the hearsay rule is for an excited utterance. And if you're to believe the testimony of Cassidy Hutchinson about that circumstance, then what was going on in the front of the beast, with the president swearing and seizing at the steering wheel and all of that, that seems like it might fit a bit into the excited utterance theory. So it's not even clear that testimony on that subject by Ms. Hutchinson would not have been available. But when you look at the way he's described his case, that really isn't critical to any of his lines of proof. So I think this is a distraction and essentially a confession by the Republicans that they've got nothing on Jack Smith, nothing about the adequacy of his testimony to convict Trump for crimes and conspiracies. And so, they go after Ms. Hutchinson.
Senator Whitehouse, we're going to squeeze in a commercial break here. And please stay with us, because when we come back, I want to ask you about something that Donald Trump is now taking credit for that was actually accomplished, big surprise, by a previous president when Donald Trump was in diapers. Once again this morning, Donald Trump took credit for something accomplished by a previous president.
So what are you willing to pay for Greenland?
Well, I'm not going to have to pay anything. We're going to have total access to Greenland. We're going to have all military access that we want. We're going to be able to put what we need on Greenland because we want it. We're talking about national security and international security.
Donald Trump is actually right about that. We can build any military installation we want in Greenland, and we've been able to do that since Donald Trump was in diapers. I mean, when he was in diapers the first time, when he was little. President Harry Truman negotiated the deal with Greenland after World War II that is still in place today. We had as many as 13 military bases in Greenland in the past, and now it's down to 1. But thanks to the Harry Truman Agreement, the United States has always had the right to use Greenland in any way we want, just about any way the American military wants to. We could build almost as many bases as we want there, which makes everything Donald Trump has been saying about Greenland for the last 6 years all the more insane. And he will now continue to tell utterly ignorant Fox interviewers that he achieved some kind of deal in Greenland by talking not to anyone from Greenland, not to anyone from Denmark, but to the Secretary General of NATO, who, of course, did not negotiate a deal with Donald Trump on Greenland. There is no new deal on Greenland. We will continue to be operating under the Truman deal, and Donald Trump will continue to lie about it. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse is back with us. Senator, Donald Trump obviously achieved nothing in Greenland, but there was no reason to try to achieve any of it because Harry Truman had already done it.
Yeah, this has been the case for a long time. I've actually been to our existing base in Greenland called Thule, which is an airstrip and has, information detection equipment. The agreement that was reached allows us to open ports, bases. It's about as broad a defense capability agreement as one could imagine. And what's striking is that for all these months, while Trump has been making these threats that have been highly destructive and disruptive to NATO, this has been true the entire time. And it's hard to imagine that there isn't one person in the White House or in the Defense Department who didn't tell him, Mr. President, we can already do everything that you want us to do. Here's the list of all the things we're allowed to do. All you have to do is go and execute on this existing agreement, which again makes you think, okay, if he has the power already under the Truman Agreement to do essentially everything he needs for our national security in Greenland, in addition to the base we already operate there, then why all the big talk that is so disruptive to NATO? And all I can say, Lawrence, is that everybody in Europe got hurt by this stupid talk. The United States of America got hurt by this talk. NATO got hurt by this talk. The one big winner from
Senator Sheldon Whitehouse gets tonight's last word. We're going to have to leave it there tonight, Senator. We're out of time, but that is the perfect spot to end it. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.